Welcome back everyone, and so from my last video you already know what the parts we ordered from Banggood. Here's all the parts opened up and segregated. Couple of extra parts that we're going to use in this build is the receiver. This is the Jumper R1 Plus receiver, and I'm gonna be using the Dal Prop 5046 if I'm right. It's a Dal Prop 5046. It's a 5-inch prop, 4.6-inch pitch. I'm gonna be using one of these two antennas. It's either gonna be a Pagoda antenna or a Speedy B. Depends, because the Pagoda is a SMA connector, but the Speedy B is RP SMA. But the pigtail with our VTX came with a SMA pigtail. So if I have to use the Speedy B, I'll have to use this adapter. So depending on how much it creates a problem with the clarity or a noise in the video, I might choose to switch the antenna. So recap from our last video, this is our ZMR 250 frame and the remaining parts. We're not gonna be using these standoffs for now, nor these, or the camera mount, so we'll keep this for later. Again, these are the HSKRC motors. We're not going to be using the VTX as of now yet. For now, not the camera, not the receiver, not the props, not the antennas. Just put it aside for a bit for now. We're going to start by building our frame, and if you guys didn't know, this is our stack. I'm going to put it aside for a while as well. So first things first, you want to segregate your motor screws. Your motor screws come in two different sizes. At least if you ordered the same motors that I did, these came with two separate sizes of motor screws. This one is about, I don't know, let me see. This is about 10 mm and the other size is about 6 mm. So depending on the size of the arms, or if you're using any skids under the motors, you might want to consider using different sizes of screws. So here's the thing. So if you take one of these screws, so if you have two sizes, just do this trial run. Put one of these screws through the arm holes for the motor screw holes, and hold your motor right next to it. So I don't know if you guys can see this on camera. So you do not want the motor screw to be any longer than the mounting hole on the motor itself, on the stator. So after you fit the motor screw, you want it to be flush. So once you hold it right next to the motor arm, you do not want the screw to go past the motor base. That's how long you want the screw to be. In this case, I'm going to be using the shorter screws, so these longer screws can be saved for later on. I'm going to put these aside for now. And again, don't throw away these screws, save them. You might need them later on. So next thing you want to do is segregate or separate your screws that came with your frame, because we're gonna need that too. So I'm gonna cut open this bag, pour everything out, and separate individual sizes of screws. I'll probably just fast forward this part. I have separated all the screws now for the frame. So let's figure out how to put these together. Let's put the motor aside for now. We'll start by building the frame. So the first things first, we'll leave the top plate for later on. We don't need it right now. What we're gonna need is the arms, the base plate, and the brace plate. So there's the base plate with BASE, and there's a brace plate, BRACE. So we gotta figure out what's the front and the back of the quad. Looks like it's pretty much symmetrical, and since this side looks clean, I'm gonna leave this as the bottom plate. And so the way it's supposed to go is you line the base plate and the brace plate so the holes line up, but you got to slide in the arms within it. So you take the base plate, you take the arm, and slide in the screws. We're gonna start with 2 screws for now. Flip it over and check in your base plate. There you go. Now that you have this, you're gonna want to put in your lock nuts. Just to hand tighten this for now. You don't have to like really tighten it, because we're gonna have to adjust it later on. This didn't even come with instructions, so it's really hard to figure out what's gonna happen. So the next step is to slide in the next arm, and from the bottom push in the screw. We're gonna do 2 at this point, because I think we're gonna run short on screws. I think the stack is missing a few screws. We'll get to that once we are done. Again, hand tighten, 2 arms done, flip it over, slide the next arm through, align the holes, and slot in a couple of screws. Now it's time to put in the rest of the screws and the rest of the nuts. Okay, at this point, once everything is fixed, I would suggest you go ahead and tighten all the screws. There you go. Now that the base plate and the arms are fixed, now the next thing we're gonna do is the motors. So it doesn't matter what motor goes where, they all are bidirectional. They can spin whatever way we configure them to. For now, we'll just get rid of these prop nuts because we don't need them, and if you lose them, it's gonna be a hassle. We're just gonna keep them aside. We're not gonna throw them away. Okay, so what you do is, again, it doesn't matter. I think it's pretty much symmetrical, so it doesn't matter what side is the front or the back. What you want to do is place the motor so that the wires are coming inwards towards the quad along the arms. It doesn't matter where the wires are for now. It's just that make sure that they run along the arm. So what you want to do is take a motor screw, and since I'm right-handed, I'm going to turn it the other way around. Again, make sure the wire is along the arm. Align the holes up, to the motor and lightly screw in. I mean, it's not completely tightened. You don't want that. You're just trying to get all the screws in their right screw holes. I generally do the diagonals first because that kind of, right now the motor's not moving. All I have to do is put the hole in the screw in the hole and just screw it through. There you go. One motor done, almost. And we're gonna do this all the way around. Again, we're not tighten the screws yet. We're just gonna leave them loose for now. We're gonna come back and do all the screws once we are done with the build. There we go. All 4 motors are done, and this is how we want our motor wires to be routed. Again, the motor screws are not completely tightened yet. We will get back to that, but at this point we want to start working on our stack. So let's get our stack out. The shielding and the stack. We're gonna need the stack hardware, so let's keep it aside. We're gonna need the capacitor and the XT60 wires, and put everything else aside. So at this point the frame is partly done. So what we're going to do is, this is blue tack. This is basically what I use to stick my components. Like it holds my electronic components. If I'm soldering on, this is what keeps everything in place. So what we're going to do is unscrew the stack. Again, this has some rubber gummies onto it. Disconnect the cable, keep it aside for now. Let's start working on the ESC. So the flight controller goes to the side. Take out the sticker. So the first thing we're going to do is solder on the XT60. Since we're using a 4S connection, we might as well use XT60. I'm going to reuse the wire that actually came with the stack. So the first thing I'm going to do is connect my soldering iron and heat it up, because that's going to take a while. And I'm going to set it to the highest possible setting. That's, I think, 750 degrees Fahrenheit. Always have a wet sponge on ready, so that when you're soldering stuff you can clean your soldering iron. All I do is just take a sponge and squirt on some water. It's just good enough. And what you want to do is, just every time you're going to solder, you want to work with a clean tip. You see how shiny that is? It's not yet shiny because it's not hot yet. So the first thing we're going to do is pre-tin the wires that came with it. So I'm just going to stick it onto the blue tack. Let's see if it's hot enough. Not yet. Until then, I'm going to apply some flux onto the wires before pre-tinning them. Again, all of the stuff that I'm using, it's all kind of fancy stuff, you could get like some solid or paste like flux like this and use the same. This just makes my life easy if I'm using a flux pen like this. You might want to get it, you might not want to, it's all left to you. Clean tip. I'm gonna hit the wires and apply some solder. This is called pre-tinning. The wires do come pre-tinned from the factory, but then again, they're not lead-free solder. It doesn't flow the same way like the lead-based solder does. So I just like to pre-tin them again. Just a little bit of solder to make my life easier. Heat the wire and bring the solder together, and the solder should just flow through the wires. Yep. Now that the wires are done, put them aside. Now we're gonna solder on an XT60 plug to these wires. Now I know that I said we're not going to use any extra parts that did not come with the package, but essentially a Mamba stack should have come with an XT60, but it did not. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use an XT60 plug that I have lying around. Again, if you guys are getting into FPV, you're gonna need a lot more of these XT60 plugs. This is an XT60 female and this is an XT60 male. Usually the batteries come with an XT60 male plug and an XT60 female plug goes on the quad. So what I'm gonna do is, this is another trick I picked up from Ledrib from Rotor Riot. So what happens is when you're trying to solder on wires onto your XT60, it gets really hot because the wires are pretty big and it takes a lot of heat to get the solder to flow through these joints. And what happens is this plug is plastic, so these metal pins can actually melt through these plugs. So the trick is to have an XT60 male plug and just connect it through and then do the soldering onto the female, because this male plug is going to hold the pins in place, not allowing them to distort through the female plug. Again, the principle is simple. So here's what you need to do. Just you see this cavities? I don't know if you guys can see this. Let me just zoom in a bit. That's as best as it can get. So these cavities, I want you to fill these with solder. Just dump a bunch of solder in there. Again, don't hold the soldering iron too long, otherwise you're gonna melt through the plastic. Just make sure the cavity is filled with solder. You see the shiny thing? Let me see if I can pick it up if it's not too hot. See, that's how your solder should look like. Okay, there we go. Now we do the same thing, we flip it around and we do the same thing to the positive lead. Heat up the plug a little bit and just dump a bunch of solder on it. Don't put too much, just enough. It's just gonna make your life a lot easier when you solder the wires. Now these wires can get really hot because these are thicker gauge wires, so I suggest you use a pair of tongs, or even what I like to do is use these. I forgot what they're called. They're kind of scissors, but they're like forceps tweezers, but they lock on and they just hold the wire in place, so you don't have to like spend effort on holding them in place. Once I lock this in, this is locked in. All I have to do is place it where it needs to go, and we're good. So the first thing, we're gonna solder on the positive lead. So I heat up the plug, let the solder melt through first. Again, if it's not melting, all you need to do is put on a little bit of fresh solder onto your soldering gun, and there you go. There you go. You flow it through, and then bring the wire close and let the whole joint flow together. There you go. Go. And it's gonna be hot, so don't try to touch it right away. And this is how your solder joint should look like. Nice golden and shiny. Shouldn't look like a blob, or it's just gonna be a cold solder. Again, it's still hot. I'm trying not to touch it with my bare hand. Now that the male plug's job is done, this can go back into my storage. Now at this point, I like to use heat shrinks. Again, if you have XT60 plugs, you will have heat shrink tubes. You could use the same, or if you don't, I don't know. Again, if you have bought a bunch of these XT60 plugs, you will have these heat shrinks. These are pretty much rubber tubes which go on to the wire, and they just provide some insulation onto the solder joints. What I like to do is just take a flame gun and just heat them through, and they should just shrink tight onto the connectors. There you go. Same thing for the negative wire, the ground, I suppose. I also have a heat gun, but again, not everyone's gonna have it, so I'm just gonna use a flamethrower. This is my flamethrower. So it's basic a gas lighter, a butane gas lighter. You could get it at Walmart or any hardware store, even probably at your Target. So now that the XT60 lead is done, let's get on to the ESC. That's the first thing that we're gonna do. So first things first, I think since this is gonna be a low profile stack, this is the top of the ESC. You see this shunt resistor? This is the top of the ESC. That's where the plug comes up. And I want to have the capacitor coming from on the top. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the capacitor, pull it out from its package. So capacitor is gonna have two leads, one longer, one shorter. The longer one is gonna be the positive lead, and the one with the stripe, hang on, let me just try to get it focused. There you go. The longer lead is going to be the positive, and the shorter lead is going to be the negative. And also another way to recognize the negative lead is going to be this strip. The strip is going to be negative. So you want to make sure negative goes to negative on the ESC, positive goes to positive. Before that, we'll just straighten out the leads. Sometimes they come in bent. Don't try to force it, you don't want to break the lead off. So This is the negative pad, this is the positive pad. Negative goes to negative, positive goes to positive. There are holes in the ESC pads for soldering the capacitors. So we're gonna pass the positive into the positive hole, negative into the negative hole, and we'll just gonna push it through as close as possible. And this is how we're gonna do it. You see? That's good enough. So at this point, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bend the legs up so that the capacitor doesn't move. It's basically just to tighten it, and I'm gonna solder it in place, and at the same time pre-tinning. Again, I'm gonna use some flux because that's gonna make soldering a lot more easier. All I'm gonna do is take the soldering gun, make sure it's up to temperature, apply a bit of fresh solder, pre-tin the pads. So at this point I'm gonna pre-tin the positive pad first. Over to the ground. The ground is gonna be a lot harder to do, is because the whole PCB is lined with copper that connects all the grounds together, so it's gonna take a lot more effort. And if it's not flowing properly, don't try to force it. Just try to get some flux in. Yeah, it's gonna get pretty toasty, so be careful about that. And then gentle wiggle. I have to use some tongs to hold the ESC in place. Make sure you're not shorting anything. And at this point, the whole board is gonna be super hot. So don't try to pick it up with your bare hands because you're gonna burn yourself. Let me see if I can get it focused so you guys can see it. There you go. This is how it's supposed to look. At this point, I'm gonna flip the board over and clip off the excess leg of the capacitors carefully. There you go. Let me see if it's cold enough to handle. Nope, it's really hot. So again, be careful while handling the PCBs once you solder them, because they're going to be hot as hell. So now that the capacitor is soldered on, let's solder on the XT60. Again, black is negative, red is positive, but we'll get to that a bit later. For now, let's pre-tin the motor pads. We got 6 on each side. Apply a little bit of flux. Let me see if I can zoom. This is the maximum zoom I can get out of this lens. I'm using an 1855 lens. And then cleaning the tip. It's routine. Get the solder on. The motor pads have been pre-tinned. Again, the PCB is going to be super hot, so be careful handling it. Now at this point, we gotta figure out how we're gonna mount this on the frame. I burnt my finger. Crap. Move this all to the side. Bring over the frame that we just assembled. And at this point, make sure we're not gonna burn anything else, especially ourselves. Now, we're gonna use the motor, the hardware that came with the ESC. Where is my hobby knife? Like this. Cut it open. Especially what we're looking for is the stack screws. These ones. There you go. And we will need standoff. So we're going to be using these rubber gummies as standoffs because our frame did not come with, it did come with standoffs, but what we're looking for are spacers, which we do not have, so we're going to use these rubber spacers. These four. There you go. So what we're going to do is, see these 4 holes on the outside, these are 30 by 30 stack. These inner holes is what we are interested in. I'm gonna just pass through these screws. And just flip it over and pop these in. These are gonna act as spacers for our ESC. I'm not sure if this is the right way to do it, but this is what we're working with. So it's also supposed to come with 4 lock nuts, which we will be using. So now we mount our ESC. There we go. Now, at this point, we gotta figure out where we're gonna run our XT60. So if we connect our XT60 wire like this, we're gonna be running it from the outside. Let me see the top plate if it has a provision. So this is the top plate. This is where the antenna comes out. So what I want to do is, this is going to be a standoff, this is going to be a standoff. I want to have the XT60 come through the side over here. So yeah, we'll just mount it the conventional way at this point. So add a little bit more flux. So I'm gonna take the stack off for a bit, put the frame aside, bring our blue tack back, stick it on. Now put these aside. I'm gonna come in from this side. I'm gonna take a little bit of solder onto the soldering iron. Again, the ground is gonna be a pain, but stick around. Just make sure you don't mess it up. It's gonna take a bit, so be patient. Just wiggle around a little bit. Heat the pad at the same time. hot. You just want to confirm. Just add a little bit more solder and make sure it just flows through. Don't be afraid to add a little bit of solder onto the ground pad because it takes a lot of heat and a lot of solder. Again, at this point, the whole PCB is going to be like super hot, so don't be a hero. Use tweezers. See, this is how it's supposed to look. Nice shiny blobs, not cloudy. Again, it's hot, hot, hot. Now let's get the frame back. And we are going to put our stack on. So at this point, we're gonna pre-tin our motor wires, and at the same time, we're gonna cut them to length so that we don't have any excess motor wires. And if you guys are wondering why there's like dead silence between the stuff that I do, is because I don't feel comfortable speaking when I'm doing something. Like, you know? I feel like if I'm speaking about something without thinking about it, or if I'm doing something while thinking about something else, I'm just gonna mess it up. That's why I don't speak when I work. That's why I am speeding through all these minute processes that I'm doing, like pre-tinning the wires. I know you don't need a tutorial from me to tell you how to pre-tin wires. There's like a billion other YouTubers who do the same, aka Joshua Bardwell, Mr. Steel, Ledrid, Ciotti, FPV. All I'm trying to do is bring something new to the table. The $99 build, that's my jam. New stuff. I don't know if you guys are gonna hear all this or if I'm just gonna skip through, but it's good, you know, trying to get practice speaking while working. Really not good at it though. Ah, come on. There you go. Okay, let's start soldering up the motor wires. Did I pre-tin these? Yep, I did. Let's start from the top left. So one wire goes around. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I was out of focus for a while, a bit there. So what I'm trying to do right now is just trying to solder up all the motor wires to the ESC pads. It's pretty simple, basically. There's like 9 pads on the motors. There's 3 here, 3 there, 3 here, and 3 here. So 6 on the right, 6 on the left. So the way it goes is 3 motor wires goes to the top 3 on the left, 3 motor wires on the bottom left goes to the 3 on the top bottom left, and 3 on the top right goes to 3 on the top right, 3 motor wires on the bottom right goes to the 3 on the bottom right. So what I'm doing here right now is trimming up the exposed wires, because ideally you want the length of these wires to be approximately the same as the length of the pad that they're getting soldered onto. If it's too short, it's not going to make good connection. If it's too long, it's going to give you a pain in the butt trying to get soldered onto, and it's going to stick out like a sore thumb, which you don't want. So just trim it up to the size of the pad that you're going to solder your wires onto, and you should be good to go. Whew. That was the last of the motor wires. And at this point, we have all 4 of our motor wires soldered up. Oh, excuse me. We're gonna rearrange the wires later, but at this point, this is how your quad should look like. Let me just zoom out. There you go. All wires sorted up. You see, looking clean. I don't think I could get any closer than this. Now, moving on to the flight controller. So let's figure out what all we need to do with the flight controller. Taking the sticker off, you see the arrow up here? Arrow pointing forwards. This is where we want it. So I'm assuming right now this is the front of the quad, because the XT60 is coming out of the back. Let's mount it up here. And just to keep everything in place, we're gonna lock it with the screws that came with the stack. Got 4 nylon screws. Just to make sure everything is in place, just give it a couple of turns so that there's a little bit of tension on it. Don't go crazy again. There you go. Should be good enough. See? Yeah, that looks sturdy enough. So now we're gonna prepare the solder pads on our flight controller. This is the LED pad. and I'm gonna use resource remapping to use smart port telemetry on that pad. Yeah, it's gonna be 5 volt. I might as well get it up to 750. That's just gonna make my life easier. 5 volt, ground, video in, that's gonna be for the camera. That's ground. Next one's gonna be video in, that's for the camera. Then 5 volt, ground, TX3. That's gonna be for the VTX. I don't know if the camera is gonna run off 5 volts. Gonna have to test that. 5 volt, ground, TX3. That's smart audio. It's gonna be UR3. Gotta remember that. And video out for the VTX. And ground, 5 volt, and ppm. It's gonna be for our receiver. Hang on. Okay, this is ground. 5 volt. And we're gonna need S bus. And there's an RSSI pad, which we might as well use because we have an RSSI out on our R1 receiver. So RSSI, we probably won't need any of this because there's, yeah, we're not going to need this, but we're definitely using the LED pad. For smart port telemetry. There you go. There's that. Let's start with the camera because that's the first thing that we'll need to test. And let's see how much length of wire we are gonna need. The camera is probably going to be around here, so I'm guessing this much wire should be more than enough. So I'm going to trim it down. Strip it and pre-tin it. See, this is why I tend to use tools like this, because it just makes my life a whole lot easier. See how easy it is? This tool is basically like $10 or something, and it just makes stripping and prepping wire so much easier. These aren't silicone wires, so these will burn off if it gets too hot, so you got to be like really quick. So add some flux to it so that the solder flows nice and easy. Alexa, what's the time?
It's 10:22 p.m.
Okay, so the camera's wired up. Let's hope there is no short anywhere. Now let's move on to the VTX. Okay, this is 5 volt and ground in. And these two are the 5V and ground out, which we will not be using. So I'm just gonna desolder this and take this out. It's just gonna cause clutter, which we don't need, because we are powering the camera right off of the flight controller. So 5V out and ground. So the middle two wires are gonna come off. Now for the receiver. We'll be running the Jumper R1 Plus receiver. Comes with the connectors, comes with an upgrade wire. This is what we use. This is what you use to upgrade the firmware, which we're not going to be doing it now. This is the wire that we're concerned with. So it is black is ground, red is 5V, white is S bus, blue is S port, that's smart port telemetry, and green is RSSI. Okay. It's gonna be S bus, purple is gonna be telemetry, and green is gonna be RSSI. So we'll go to the RSSI pad. It's a cool thing that these Mamba stacks come with a special RSSI pad, because if a receiver can send out RSSI, you could just directly solder it to the RSSI port. And since we're going to be using smart port telemetry, we're going to be using the LED pad, using resource remapping, using soft serial. Why? Don't ask. Because this is an F4 flight controller, you cannot use a regular UART pad for smart port telemetry because it's an inverted signal, free sky, blah blah blah. Okay, I guess that's pretty much everything there is to solder. I am going to do a smoke test with a smoke stopper. Connect everything up and connect the battery, but not directly, but through a smoke stopper. And if we have done everything right, nothing should burn. Okay, here's our smoke stopper. Moment of truth. Negative to negative, positive to positive. The battery, and fingers crossed. Let's hope nothing burns. Okay, don't see a smoke. Everything lights up and we are good. Now before moving on to the computer for the Betaflight configuration and the rest of the stuff, you remember how I said that I'm not sure if the camera takes 5V or 12V, because that's what happens when you buy these generic cameras. Because here's the instruction sheet, and all it says is FPV 12V, DC 12V power input, and I'm guessing that is the maximum. So I'm not sure if this thing is gonna work with 5V or not. So it's better if we test it out right now before we head on to the computer and we wrap up everything, so that if the camera is not powering on, we could just resolder the power wire over to the VBAT that is right at the end. So the way I like to do it is I still use a smoke stopper until my quad is completely covered up. I like to use the smoke stopper. You connect the camera, make sure the VTX has the antenna fixed to it. Do not power on your quad for the first time without a VTX antenna, because out of the box you never know what power level the VTX is sitting on. Hopefully it's on pit mode, but if it is not, if it's any higher power level mode, even 25 milliwatts, without the antenna, it'll probably fry the VTX. So once the quad is powered up, the camera is all connected, you take out your trusty goggles, turn it on, and what I like to do is, once the goggle is powered up, I just like to put it into auto scan mode. This is a Eachine VR007 Pro. The way I do on this is I press and hold the third button. It goes into auto scan mode. Oh, there you go. We have video. Okay. Again, the channel that shows up on the auto scan mode, do not trust that, because when you're this close to the VTX, sometimes you just the video kind of leaks into different bands. So just surf through multiple channels and there you go. We have video feed on D2. This is the camera, as you can see. Hey YouTube, that's me. So yeah, so I can verify right now that we have video from the camera. So the camera is working off 5 volts, so that's good. So that's it for the workbench. Now we will move on to the computer to do the Betaflight setting, which is going to be in a next video. So stay tuned, and we'll get back once we're ready to configure Betaflight. Peace. Okay, this is peace. Yeah. Peace. Yeah.